ATLs are a really effective and efficient way of testing vehicles. We can test modern vehicles using modern test equipment in a really effective way without the use of an assistant, and that's where the effectiveness and the efficiency comes in. One-person testing is the natural progression from automated test lanes. It's exactly the same specification, but it does not require the installation of a computer-controlled roller brake tester. So if you're a garage that's recently had a roller brake tester installed, you can continue to use that. Motorcycle decelerometers will be introduced this year, and they will be introduced on a voluntary basis for motorcycle garages. But they're also very, very useful for car garages that test trikes and quads, because with an adapter you can then test the brakes quite efficiently and quite effectively on those peculiar vehicles.
The introduction of one-person testing, whether using an ATL, automated test lane, or an OPTL, a one-person test lane, means some changes are required to the test procedure, as there's no longer a requirement to have an assistant. Testers should be familiar with the test routine set out in the introduction of the inspection manual. However, testing without an assistant, whilst not deviating from the routine, requires a number of changes to the test procedure, with subtle variations depending on the layout of the test equipment. The tester must ensure that all the testable items are checked in accordance with the inspection manual. But it helps if this is done in a logical and efficient way. This DVD gives guidance on a procedure to adopt.
Adversely affected by the operation of another lamp or the horn.
Brian Gray is a VOSA technical trainer who is going to take us through the test routine for one-person testing. We'll assume that all the pre-checks have been completed and the vehicle registered on the VTS device.
As usual, test starts here in the driver's seat, ensuring that we've put the steered wheels on unlocked turn plates. We'll carry out all the usual interior checks, and we can then do lock-to-lock check to check for any roughness or tightness in the steering mechanism. Not forgetting that if we've got power steering fitted, we must have the engine running for all checks that require steering movement. We strongly recommend that we use exhaust extraction equipment because we're going to have the engine running a lot all the way throughout the test. We then use the mirrors in the test bay to check the operation, interaction of the lights, not forgetting that we must check the hazard warning lights with the ignition on, the ignition off. When we're finished with the lights, we can turn the engine off. We'll leave the side lights and the rear fog light on. We'll pop the bonnet and we'll get out of the vehicle. Now we're at the front of the vehicle, we can carry out all the usual checks across the front of the vehicle, tap in the appropriate lights to check for flicker. We'll make our way down the off side of the vehicle, checking all the relevant items by the top side routine in the manual. Across the back, tap the lights, check for flicker. Come down the near side. Once we come back to the front, we can lift the bonnet. We can carry out all the relevant checks under the bonnet, fuel system, engine not running, and brakes not pressurised. Having returned to the driver's cabin, started the engine, brought the ramp up to a convenient height, I can now carry out the lock-to-lock checks, checking for components fouling, brake hoses stretching, twisting, etc. I can bring the wheels back to the straight ahead position, lower the ramp, move it onto the wheel plate detectors. With the engine running, we can check for free play in the steering before applying the brake pedal application device. We can carry out the under bonnet checks on a fuel system, exhaust, power steering, engine running, brakes pressurised. We can then check steering under load using the wheel plate detectors and check for any play and any visible suspension components, again using the wheel plate detectors. Move the vehicle so it's the correct focal distance from the beam setter, align the beam setter to the vehicle, align it to each headlamp in turn, carry out headlamp aim assessment, not forgetting to tap each light, check it for flicker. Raise the hoist, leaving the engine running and the brakes pressurised. The tester can now carry out the underside inspection following the figure of 8 routine as recommended by the inspection manual, using the wheel plate detectors to check steering and suspension components. We'll also be checking fuel system, power steering components, braking system under pressure, engine running as required by the manual. You can then come to the front, jack the vehicle the appropriate way to the suspension type. And then it's an ideal opportunity once it's jacked to check the steering rack gate has expanded, as it's quite easy to turn the wheels lock to lock. We now lower the hoist sufficiently to remove the brake pedal application tool, switch the engine off, bring it up to a convenient height to carry out the remainder of the front suspension checks, remembering to put a bar under the wheel as necessary. It's worth noting that for suspension types figure 3, 3A and 4, as shown in the inspection manual, no need to put a bar under the wheel because all the items can be satisfactorily checked using the wheel plate detectors. We can then carry out checks to the wheels, tyres, wheel bearings, and we shouldn't cause any problem with ABS or traction control because we've got the ignition switched off. It's worth mentioning that the inspection manual allows for wheel bearing play to be checked using the wheel play detectors, but it's acceptable to do it by hand because we're going to rotate the wheel anyway to check for roughness, so it would make a simple procedure if we did that at the same time. We can raise the hoist again, and then before lowering the jack we can carry out any checks necessary to the drive shaft couplings, CV boots, inner sidewall of the tyre. We'll lower the front, go to the rear, jack up the rear, allowing the wheels to hang free if possible, and complete the checks to wheel bearings, suspension components and tyres. When that's completed, the only remaining checks for the underside will be the fuel system with the engine switched off and the braking system components not pressurised. For the purpose of the film, we've not covered the emissions test or the brake performance check. Clearly you can carry out the emissions test at any convenient point during the test, usually at the beginning or the end. The conventional roller brake tester is used in the normal way on OPTL, whereas an ATL brake tester will provide prompts to the tester to guide him through the sequence. VOSA recommends that the underside inspection is carried out first before the brake performance check, so the tester has the opportunity to refuse to test should there be any problem with damage to a vehicle, property or injury to a person. And it's worth as a final point to say that if any time during the test procedure the tester feels he needs the use of an assistant, then he must use one.
An ATL is no longer than a conventional test bay. The hoist is slightly longer to facilitate the wheel play detectors, but VOSA has reduced the distance behind the headlamp beam tester from 1 metre to half a metre. It's important to remember that wheel play detectors can't be fitted to any type of hoist. Consequently, VOSA requires a declaration from the hoist manufacturer that the hoist is suitable for such an installation. VOSA does not accept these declarations from equipment suppliers or installers. To summarise, one-person testing means that the recommended routine is broadly followed, but there are some significant procedural differences. When positioning the vehicle on the hoist or pit, ensure that the steered wheels are resting on unlocked turn plates. Start in the driver's seat as usual and carry out all the interior checks as well as roughness and tightness in the steering. Use the test bay mirrors to check operation and interaction of the lights. Ensure the side lights and rear fog lamps are left on to tap during the topside inspection. Carry out the initial under-bonnet checks with the engine off. Start the engine, raise the hoist and carry out the lock-to-lock checks. Lower the hoist, move the wheels onto the wheel play detectors, leave the engine running and carry out the steering free play check before applying the brake pedal application tool. Complete the under-bonnet checks of fuel, exhaust and braking systems, then check steering and suspension components using the wheel play detectors as necessary. Before jacking the vehicle, carry out the headlamp alignment check. Raise the hoist again and carry out the figure of 8 underside inspection using the wheel play detectors as necessary. Jack the front wheels. Turn the steering on each lock to check steering rack gaiters when they are fully expanded. Lower the hoist, turn off the engine, remove the brake pedal application tool and complete the front suspension checks, using a bar under the wheels if necessary. Check the front wheels and tyres and carry out the wheel bearing checks. Raise the hoist, check CV boots, drive shafts and tyre inner sidewalls. Jack the rear wheels and complete the rear wheel bearing, tyre and suspension checks. Remove the jack and finish the underside inspection with the remaining fuel and braking system checks. Emissions and brake performance checks can be carried out at any convenient point in the procedure.
It's not as complicated as it seems, but whatever routine you use, ensure all testable items are checked and checked correctly.